story begins when mankind was on the brink of extinction. Along with the evil god Vindrake who suddenly appeared in the sky, countless monsters wreaked havoc upon the land. The monsters spread across the land to kill every human, but then something appeared that made the monsters explode, and Vindrake growled in anger. The last hope of mankind arrived. They were the strongest mages of mankind, standing against the evil god. The monsters rushed to attack the mages, and our protagonist, who was at the front, ordered his comrades to prepare their magic spells. He then ordered them to fire at the monsters, which they did. He called out to the evil god and shouted to him that his end was there. He then activated his compound chanting, combining all 6 magic attributes to fire simultaneously. He attacked Vindrake with his elemental burst skill. The other mages shouted to others to support our protagonist Setsuna, which they did, launching their attack on Vindrake too. The man smiled, thinking that it was working, and they all waited for the smoke to disappear. However, Vindrake came out of the smoke completely unharmed and didn't move an inch. The mages couldn't believe it. The man gathered his magic power in his hand, shouting that they needed to hit Vindrake harder. The other mages threw another attack at Vindrake, but he shouted to them to wait because they needed to observe. He saw his comrades' magic power heading directly toward Vindrake, but then the attacks disappeared before they could hit. Shocked to see that their magic was dispelled, Vindrake teasingly asked them if this was the best they could do. Calling them squirming insects who rot in his garden and describing them as foolish and miserable creatures, the lady was horrified when they realized that their magic was not working against Vindrake. The man shouted at him to give them his orders. He cursed in panic, thinking that there must still be something they could do, but suddenly, the man behind was attacked and killed instantly. They then noticed that they were surrounded by a swarm of different monsters. The lady with cane stutteringly told him that she was running out of mana. Suddenly, the man and the lady were grabbed by the monsters while begging him to save them. Another lady who was trying to fight was eaten by a monster frog, leaving him stunned in horror. He then attacked the monsters with all his magic power, shouting at them to stop, but then Vindrake appeared behind him and attacked him. A moment later, all of his companions were dead, and he was severely injured. He tried his best to sit down and was stunned in horror when he saw their place burn down, all the humans dead, and the monsters enjoying their feast on humans. He clenched his fist, asking if this was mankind's defeat. Vindrake replied that it was a futile struggle, making him think that it was not yet their defeat. He cast a spell and launched his fist at Vindrake, punching him, but Vindrake managed to block his punch with his arms. Still, Vindrake screamed in pain and was injured by his attack. Shocked that his attack worked, he wondered how such low-level magic could leave some damage on Vindrake. He then understood that he could defeat the evil god with just that. But he noticed he only realized this in his current condition. Vindrake lifted his hand to attack him and told him that this was as far as he would go, but then the pendant on his necklace moved and released a bright light. He knew that it was what he had received from the headmaster and remembered asking the headmaster if the necklace was the necklace of rebirth. To which the headmaster replied yes, and explained that the necklace of rebirth holds the power of the spirit of time, allowing him to redo his past regrets only once. He told the headmaster that he had never had one regret before, and asked him if he thought it would be a waste on him. The headmaster laughed at his words and told him that he expected it from the top graduate of his magic academy, but he seriously told him that he was sure he would need it in the future. He grabbed his pendant, thinking about his regret, and shouted that his regret was that he didn't choose to pick that magic at that time. He then shouted to Vindrake that he would definitely win against him this time, and then he was back at the school. He opened his eyes, and a man behind him hit his back, telling him not to space out too much because it was his turn next. He looked back and saw that it was Leo. He remembered that Leo was supposed to go missing before the evil god appeared. He then looked around, wondering if that building was the Magic Academy, and realized that he had really gone back 10 years. He then swore that he would not let their defeat happen again, and that he would ensure victory against the evil god. Leo then tells him that he had been saying it was his turn, and reminds him that they are at a ceremony of blessings, prompting him to apologize and walk to the stage. He heads directly to the map. One of the students whisperingly asks if he is the greatest genius in the history of the academy, and a lady replies that she heard Setsuna has the magic affinity for every magic path. The man opened the magic book, and he covered his face when the pages flew out of the book, knowing that there were different paths in magic. To activate magic, a different technique is required, which is why they have to choose a magic path, making learning different magic from different paths difficult. It was akin to not being able to believe in two gods at the same time. The man then calls his name and orders him to choose the magic path he desires. He then pointed to one of the symbols, asking him if he was sure that his choice would be it. He knew that it was a long-range magic symbol, and normally it was the right choice because elements are made from mana and then aimed at their enemy. With the low risk of being attacked with long-range attacks are normally enough to defeat their enemy. He remembers becoming the strongest mage in the world with long-range magic, but it was useless against the evil god. He then turned away from the long-range symbols and walked to the symbol on the side. He then stopped at the sharp symbol. Making the man shocked and the students whisper in disbelief, Leo asked him what he was doing when he said that morning he would pick long-range magic. Yet he picked close combat magic above everything else and asked him if he was aware that it was considered the worst of the worst. The man explained to him that the close combat magic path mainly focuses on body enhancement, and he can only attack the enemy that is close to him. Also, that magic path is already abandoned, and it was basically the same as going into a battle filled with bows and arrows with only a stone axe. The man then asked him if he was just going to throw away his future, but he didn't reply because he already knew about it, and it was pretty much hopeless as a mage with that magic path. But against the evil god Vindric, it was the only choice to defeat him. To achieve it, he had to do it. The man and the students stared at him in horror, and the headmaster seriously looked at him, but he still reached for the close combat symbol and chose it. The symbol was marked on the back of his hand while he thought that he would choose it and beat the crap out of the evil god. When he saw that the symbol was successfully marked on the back of his hand, he confidently smiled, but the students were horrified, witnessing him choose the close combat path. The man closed the magic book, and Cyrus Arclight, the head of the long-range magic department, shakily told him that he had intended to entrust him with all his knowledge if he had chosen long-range magic. Cyrus then shouted at him that he would have become the strongest mage and that glory was promised even to him, his mentor. But he just turned around, knowing that glory would be meaningless in 10 years. He knows that in 10 years humanity will face defeat, and in 5 years the evil god will appear. He gets off the stage looking at his symbol, aware that he has knowledge from the first time, but hardly any practical experience with close combat magic. He also wonders how he will develop that magic before the evil god's appearance, unaware that Cyrus was fuming with anger. A moment later, the announcer tells the second-year students who have completed the rite of acquisition to proceed to their respective field classrooms. He looked around, wondering where the classroom for close combat magic was, and noticed that Leo wasn't there. He then asks a man if he could show him the way to the close combat room. But the man is just shocked to see him and rushes away with a lady, making excuses not to talk to him. He looks around and sees the students whispering about him. He then heard some of the students say it was over for him too, and that he'll learn his lesson for choosing such a field to stand out. He realizes that just by choosing close combat, the treatment towards him is quite different from last time. However, he decides to ignore them and thinks that he'll have to find his room himself. He then remembered that there should be a map of the entire campus in the courtyard, so he headed to the courtyard. But while he was walking, he heard someone shouting "Fireball!" Shocked and wondering if there was a fight in a place like this. He then saw a lady being pushed and shouting at the men to give it back because it was a precious brooch her mother had bought for her. One of the men raised the brooch, asking her if it was a magical tool for storing mana. Another man then said it was too fine a high-class item for commoners like her, but they'd make good use of it. Setsuna knew that the one being bullied was from the close combat department, and the 3 aggressors were from the long-range department. The man released his fire, suggesting to the lady that she should take the brooch back by force if she wanted it, using her weakest close combat magic, and threw fireballs at her. She tried her best to dodge the fireballs, and Setsuna noticed that she used the basics of close combat magic, a physical boost that enhances physical abilities. However, he also knew that even if she managed to avoid some magic, the reach was too different. She then conjured something with her power, shouting at the bullies that the brooch was something her mother had saved money for years to buy for her, and she'd never hand it over to the likes of them. She formed a blade, and he recognized it as close combat magic, the mana blade. The fire mage laughingly told her it was hopeless and threw fireballs at her again, taunting her about whether that dagger would reach him. She was hit by one of the fireballs, throwing her to the ground. The man teasingly told her she was pathetic and that no matter what she did, it wouldn't reach them, the long-range mages. The fire mage then threw another fireball at her, shouting that she would probably spend her whole life never getting anything like it. Stunned and fear as the fireballs neared her, Setsuna used his magic power and dashed to the men at speed. She saw him reaching for her, and fortunately, he grabbed her away in time to avoid the fireballs, leaving the bully stunned in horror and shock. He asked her if she knew where the close combat magic department was, telling her that he wanted someone to guide him there, making the lady look at him confused. One of the bullies shouted, asking if he was Setsuna Cromwell, and they noticed he had chosen close combat magic based on the symbol on the back of his hand. The fire mage asked his friends if they were serious and shouted that it was perfect. He released a fireball in his hand, telling his friend that if Setsuna was in close combat, they could beat him up as much as they wanted. Setsuna walked towards them, telling them that close combat magic is indeed weak, but it depends on how they use it. While observing, he noticed there was room for improvement. He then told them that the quality of the magic field doesn't necessarily determine the outcome of a battle. The lady shouted at him to stop, warning that those men were seniors and he could get hurt, but the fire mage threw fireballs at him and shouted to the lady that it was too late. Setsuna concentrated the magic on his legs using a physical boost specifically for leg strength and dodged every fireball with ease. He smiled, realizing that, with his current speed, he could also dodge magic, and thought that if he could move this freely, he wanted to try more. While avoiding the fireballs, he taunted the mage, noting that he had only been shooting fireballs, and asked if he couldn't use any other elements. The mage was flustered and shouted at him to shut up. Puzzled by Setsuna's movements and realizing he couldn't aim properly, the mage, now furious, gathered a huge fireball in his hands and shouted that he wasn't joking around. However, when he threw it towards Setsuna, Setsuna simply created a mana blade and slashed at the huge fireball, slicing it into two. The mage couldn't believe that his fireball had been sliced, and the lady asked Setsuna in shock if such a thing was possible, to which he replied that it was a matter of magic against magic. So the one with higher magic proficiency wins. Setsuna knew that the reason he, who didn't possess particularly high magical power, became the strongest in the world was due to precise control of magical power. He looked at his mana blade, thinking it seemed more useful than he initially thought, and if he combined its power with speed, it would be even more effective. The mage, now enraged, shouted that in that case, he'd use an extra large one. However, the mage's friends warned that it was dangerous and that if they went too far, the instructors would intervene. But the mage shouted at his friends to shut up and began to cast a spell. As the mage looked up while casting, he saw Setsuna running closer at high speed, causing him to panic but continue casting. However, Setsuna appeared in front of him faster than his incantation could be completed. Setsuna activated his mana fist and punched the mage in the stomach. The man collapsed, and the other bullies, along with the lady, were left open-mouthed in shock as he fell to the ground. Setsuna clenched his fist, confident that as long as it was within his range, he could fight effectively, even with close combat magic. One of the bullies sweated in fear, realizing that although close combat magic was supposed to be the weakest, Setsuna's mere use of it demonstrated considerable power. He extended his hand towards the men, asking them if they had forgotten something. The bully hastily handed over the brooch, thinking that it was wise to obey Setsuna for now. The two men then helped their fallen friend and walked away. Turning to the lady, he said he had retrieved her brooch and handed it back to her, inquiring if he was correct in thinking it was important to her. She relaxed and thanked him gratefully, then clipped the brooch back into her pocket. She mentioned she hadn't introduced herself and extended her hand, introducing herself as Layla Rosewell. As he was about to shake her hand, she quickly grabbed his and shook it excitedly, saying she knew who he was due to his famed affinity for all magic paths, and asked why someone like him would choose close combat magic. He wanted to say it was to defeat the evil god, but he guessed no one would believe him, so he instead asked if she could show him the way to the close combat magic department, realizing from her reaction that the orientation had already started, and saying they should hurry. They followed the silent path, noting the department's building was located at the edge of the campus, underscoring the unpopularity of close combat magic. She told him he had to teach her how to make that mana blade from earlier, and he replied that it was nothing special, as it all depended on the control of mana. He realized that close combat magic could be used in many ways depending on the circumstances, and if he could master it, he should be able to counter the evil gods to spell magic. He then recalled the day he met with the headmaster. The headmaster had removed his gloves and placed them on the table, revealing that he possessed symbols of 2 different magic paths, which shocked Setsuna. He was stunned, knowing that normally they could only take one path, and noticed that summoning magic was on the headmaster's right hand. But he had never seen a seal on the headmaster's left hand before. He asked the headmaster what the seal in his left hand was, but the headmaster told him that he would tell him when the time came, and just because it was him, he would entrust him with the secret of that second magic path. However, in the end, the headmaster never taught him that magic, and after the emergence of the evil god, the headmaster was assassinated. He had also sensed the danger posed by the headmaster's second magic path, so he swore that he'd definitely learn it and change the fate of destruction. He was brought back to his senses when Layla pointed to the old building in front of them and told him that it was over there. They rushed to the building while he was busy thinking about the problem of how he was now and how he got the headmaster's recognition. As they got closer to the door, they saw the professor waiting for them. The professor was irritated and told him that it was nice of him to be late with a woman. Layla tried to tell the professor that there was a reason for it, but the professor shouted at her that he didn't care about her excuses. The professor then told him that no matter how good his achievements were in that place, he was worthless, and now that he was in the department of close combat magic, was already trash. He grabbed the professor's hand away from him while telling him that he had been rude the whole time, and asked the professor if he was correct in assuming he was the professor of that department, and if he had any pride in the close combat magic that he was teaching. The professor was furious upon hearing his words and shouted, asking him how he dared to act like that against his professor. But he calmly replied to the professor that there are still undiscovered possibilities in close combat magic, and that is what he believes. The professor fumed with anger and thought that it looked like he needed to break the high nose of Setsuna. The professor then turned around and told him that if he was going to say that much, he should show him instead, while pointing to the students busy trying to break stones. One of the students raised his mana blade and hit the stone in front of him with all his might, but the student cursed when he saw that he couldn't even make a crack. He asked the professor what the test was, and the professor explained that it was the first test needed to determine their rank in the class. There was a crystal embedded in that black steel rock, and all he needed to do was to extract it as quickly as possible. The professor also mentioned that those who fail would be punished. He then shouted to the students that it had already been an hour, yet none of them had managed to break it. The students replied that, easy as he might say, the stone was really hard, and they questioned how they were supposed to break it with the magic they have learned so far. One of the students loudly speculated that the professor was frustrated because he hadn't been chosen for promotion, prompting his friend to whisper a warning to lower his voice since the professor could still hear him. The professor, noticing a free rock on the side, challenged him to demonstrate the possibilities of close combat magic, but he would only have 10 minutes. Layla protested to the professor that breaking the black steel rock in just 10 minutes was impossible, questioning if he hadn't noticed that this rock was larger than the others. The professor, however, simply showed a timer and informed him that while they were arguing, he now had only 9 minutes left. He gently pushed Layla backward and touched the stone, examining it for a moment. The professor teasingly asked him why he was speechless, suggesting that if he bowed down and apologized, he might be given additional time. He responded with a firm no, asserting that 10 seconds was more than enough. This statement irritated the professor, who asked him to repeat what he said. Layla shouted wordly that he was being reckless. The professor, thinking them foolish, noted that the black steel rock was not only large, but also had a high density, and even he could only break it after 30 minutes. The professor then mockingly shouted that he wouldn't have a second chance, and since he said 10 seconds, he should do it in 10 seconds. He calmly agreed and assured the professor that he would show him while creating his mana blade. He stared at the stone, knowing that to get acknowledged by the headmaster, he had to be the best in the department at the very least. Then, grasping his mana blade, he thrust it at the stone in front of him, thinking that he couldn't let trivial things like this hinder his goal. The tip of his blade hit the center of the stone, but it didn't break, making the professor shout that he was all talk after all and question what kind of punishment awaits him for disobeying his professor. Suddenly, when he pulled the tip of his blade away, the stone cracked and exploded into pieces, leaving the professor confused. He then handed the crystal to the professor, stating that it took 10 seconds, which made the professor shout in shock. Layla, along with the other students, couldn't believe he had actually done it. The students, in shock, questioned if he was stronger than their professor. Hearing this, the professor shouted, refusing to admit such a thing, claiming it was cheating. He pointed at Setsuna, arguing that the rock was so hard it wouldn't shatter even in 10 minutes. So breaking it in 10 seconds clearly indicated cheating. However, Setsuna simply asked the professor what he meant by 10 minutes for a rock like that, and suggested that perhaps it was time for him to resign and start over as a student. The professor, shouting in anger, called him a brat, but then someone appeared behind him and called the professor by his name, Zakari. The man then grabbed Zakari's bald head, inquiring if he was bullying students again. Zakari, stuttering, addressed the man as head Professor Lionel. Lionel, with a yawn, mentioned they were interrupting his nap and told Zakari that Setsuna hadn't cheated at all because he read the flow of mana within the rock and aimed for its weakest point. Lionel then questioned Zakari's competence as an instructor for not being able to see through it, making Zakari jump a little in fear. Lionel shouted to get everyone's attention and announced that their professor, Zakari, was about to demonstrate Mana Guard. Physicianing himself, Lionel assured Zakari that if he had trained regularly, he wouldn't die from it. Zakari, in fear, swung his hands forward, admitting his fault and swearing never to do it again. Nonetheless, Lionel still punched Zakari, who fortunately managed to cover himself with his arm and slammed into the building door. Setsuna, realizing the power needed to break through the Mana Guard was extraordinary, wondered who Lionel was, knowing he was no ordinary figure. Lionel then walked closer, proudly tapping Setsuna's back, complimenting him for not being bad at all, especially for being in the lower-leveled close combat department, and encouraged him to do his best. Lionel then turned to leave, but Setsuna told him that just because he was a close combatant didn't mean he would lose to other departments. He vowed to use the strength of close combat to his advantage and become the top of his grade. Lionel smiled upon hearing Setsuna's declaration, commending his spirit and offering to teach him magic if he ever expressed the interest. As Lionel walked away, he couldn't help but marvel at the thought that someone else shared his unconventional beliefs. He mused that they had already chosen a representative for the exchange match, but now an unexpected dark horse had emerged. Later, inside the building, Lionel formally introduced himself to the students and welcomed them to the close combat department. He reluctantly announced that it was time to select a representative for the upcoming exchange match, a prestigious event where the 8 magic departments would compete for honor and prestige through a tournament format. Setsuna, having won the exchange match as the representative of the long-range combat department in his past life, knew he couldn't afford to miss out on this opportunity again. While contemplating, Setsuna noticed fragments of the black steel rock on the ground. Lionel informed him that he wasn't the only one who had passed the test. Before their arrival, someone had extracted the crystal using just his fists. Setsuna's gaze shifted towards a man at the side of the room as he wondered if those fragments could have flown from such a distance. Lionel summoned Drago Okra to come forward. Drago approached and directly questioned if he was Setsuna Cromwell, challenging why someone with aptitude in other magic paths would choose close combat. Setsuna started to explain his choice, emphasizing the unique applications of close combat magic. But Drago cut him off, loudly demanding he justify his supposedly weak physique. Bulging his muscles, Drago boasted about his family's generations-long dedication to close combat magic, and how he himself had spent 17 years honing his body for it. Suddenly, Drago dashed towards Setsuna and launched a punch at his side with considerable force. Remarkably, Setsuna didn't budge while the sheer force of the punch caused other students to fall to the ground. Drago challenged him to a fight, refusing to let the representative position fall to a mere pretender who treated close combat as a joke. Setsuna recalled hearing Drago's name during the representative match before his regression. Drago was the only notable figure from the lowly regarded close combat department. Agreeing to the challenge, Setsuna told Drago to bring it on. However, Lionel intervened, pleased that they had reached an understanding, and announced that the match would take place in a week. As Drago walked away, he warned Setsuna not to think about escaping during that week, and declared that as a close combat mage, he should be prepared to fight to the death. The others speculated about who would win, but one lady doubted Setsuna's chances against Drago given his lack of physical training. Layla, concerned, asked Setsuna if he genuinely believed he could win, to which he surprisingly answered no, leaving her shocked. Setsuna knew that he couldn't outmatch Drago's trained physique in his current state, but he was not without a strategy. Layla followed him, curious about his next move. They soon arrived at a forest where Layla was astonished to see a giant tree. She questioned the significance of their location, and Setsuna revealed it was his secret training spot, known only to him. He confidently told her that in this place he would become 3 times stronger. She told him that it was a massive tree and must be a sacred tree, more than 1,000 years old. Suddenly the tree released a green light, and the light appeared around him too, making him feel it, and realized that he was being acknowledged by the tree once again. She asked what the light coming from the tree was, and he replied that it was the blessing of the sacred tree. He explained to her that it was only given to those who've been acknowledged by the sacred tree. With gratitude for that holy mana attribute, he could recover his mana. He also told her that as long as he was there, he had no worries about running out of mana, and basically he could train until he reached his limit. She was amazed, but she knew that Drago was a natural-born close combat mage. She thought that since Setsuna had helped her get her brooch back, it was her turn now to help him, and decided to start scouting, leaving him looking at her confused. The next day, in the close combat department's training room, Layla looked around, but was shocked to see Drago easily bench, pressing the huge barbells, making her wonder what in the world was going on, thinking Drago was the only odd one there. Drago called Lionel and asked him if the black steel rocks were still in the yard, but Lionel just asked him back if he was planning on crushing all of the rocks. Drago walked away and replied that he wouldn't break them, then put the black steel rocks behind him and did his push-ups while telling Lionel that he was only borrowing them. Layla, who was peeking, was horrified and thought that if someone received a punch from Drago, they would die. She then ran away, wondering if Setsuna was really going to be fine. Meanwhile, in the forest, he was sitting and leaning on the sacred tree, busy reading a book of martial arts, when Layla exhaustingly appeared in front of him and asked if this was the time to relax like that. She reported to him that Drago was doing push-ups with 5 black steel rocks stacked on his back. He told her that he expected it, but it was already given that Drago would do that to train his physique, and told her not to worry because it was also part of his plan. He then rushed to read the martial arts book with his mama. She asked him what he meant, and he replied that a physical boost is basically reinforcement. And controlling the nervous system with mana, he explained to her that if they want to boost their legs, they just need to focus on their legs, and if they want to boost their hands, they just need to focus on their hands. So in case they want to boost their memory, they just focus on the head. He then threw the martial arts book aside when he finished it, stood up, and took off his coat while telling her that once they have got the techniques in their head, they just need to put them into practice. As a leaf fell to the tree, he sensed it and swiftly hit it with his leg before it could touch the ground. More leaves fell, and he managed to shatter every single one of them with his mana blade, leaving Layla, who was watching, amazed. She excitedly told him that she had never heard of a method to learn that fast, but he told her that it was still not enough. Suddenly, he felt dizzy and in pain. He then collapsed to the ground, overcome by tiredness. He saw his hand was bruised and severely injured, but told her that he was fine and had merely pushed his muscles to the limit with a physical boost. He then focused on boosting his healing, and in just seconds his severely injured body healed while he told Layla that he could strengthen his body in a short period of time. She told him that he didn't have to push himself like that and there must be another way, but he replied no, stating that he couldn't keep up with Drago with half-baked methods because Drago had been training for years in close combat magic after all. He then told her that in the remaining week he needed to do the destroy and reconstruct method 1,000 more times, leaving her stunned in horror and asking him what he meant by 1,000 times when just a single cycle was already that painful. But he just smiled, thinking that it was nothing compared to the training he'd undergone, reminding him of that time. Back in the orphanage, Setsuna couldn't use any magic, and every day he spent his time practicing but failed many times. Even then he kept on practicing. Even if growth was slow, he was getting better step by step. He then told her that as long as he could get stronger, it was nothing. Then, in days, they both practiced, exercised their bodies, and trained their skills together. She remembered someone said that Setsuna only had talent then, looking at him pushing up with the black steel rocks on his back. She realized that in reality, Setsuna had been working harder than anyone. The day of the match arrived, with Drago and Setsuna both on the stage. Drago told him he didn't run away, and he replied that he wouldn't run away because after all he was the representative for the close combat department. Lionel raised his hand, asking them if they were both ready, and when the tension between them was palpable. Lionel shouted for the match to begin, and Setsuna immediately dashed toward Drago. He swung his hand towards Drago, but Drago blocked his attack. He twisted one of his feet to gain force and kicked Drago with power. Drago blocked it once more but was pushed back due to the force. He noticed that Drago took everything with mana guard. He was shocked when Drago appeared in front of him and launched a strong punch toward him. It made a loud explosion sound upon impact, and the force made the students on the bench, who were watching, covered their faces. Layla, worried, called out his name, and they all waited until the smoke cleared. But they were surprised to see that he had blocked Drago's punch. The students shouted that they were going overboard and questioned if they were really just getting promoted. He told Drago that he now understands that if he took a direct hit, it'd be the end. Drago then tried to punch him again, but he avoided it. Drago continuously launched punches at him, and he continuously dodged or blocked them. Drago, shouting, asked him what was wrong and why he was only defending. But he silently continued to dodge, making Drago stop attacking to tell him that in the end, his body is still weak, and that seems to be his limit. Layla thought that even after all the training Setsuna had done, he was still no match for Drago. They both continued to attack, and Lionel, who was watching them, knew that at a quick glance Setsuna seemed to be pushed back. Drago then raised one of his feet and he swung his hand forward to block Drago's foot in time, making Drago frustrated. But Lionel knew that Setsuna was perfectly deflecting all the attacks with his mana control. The frustrated Drago didn't stop attacking him, but he just defended himself without counterattacking. Drago furiously told him that the elites always look down on close combat, but he remained silent. Drago then spoke about him and his father, who were born into a family that excels in close combat, and asked if he knew how much humiliation they have suffered so far. Drago then created a mana blade and swore to him that he would definitely change that fate with his own hands. He also created a mana blade, and they both rushed towards each other to attack. Their blades collided every time, and Drago tried to slash him, but he continuously dodged and avoided his attacks without fighting back. Drago positioned his feet and jumped above him when he just got down. He immediately looked up and leapt away to avoid Drago's attack, which caused the stage to shatter. Drago charged towards him, but he stood his ground, waiting for Drago to attack. He then blocked Drago's blade with his own, holding tightly to prevent Drago from forcing him down. He remembered overhearing students whispering that it was over for him too, and he'd learned his lesson for choosing such a magic path just to stand out. He told Drago that he could understand his words to some extent, but as he knew, he forcefully retracted his blade, causing Drago's blade to lift in the air. Then positioning his feet forward, Drago's blade was pulled back. He leaped towards Drago to attack, questioning if they weren't both aiming higher than this. Drago, stunned by his question, found his armor shattered and his mana blade exploding, but then he simply smiled at the words and laughed as he attempted to punch him, which he avoided. Smiling, he ran to Drago's side and around him, then used his physical boost acceleration skill to attack Drago from behind with his mana blade. But Drago managed to block the attacks, while Drago defended himself against the continuous assault. Layla believed that it was working, and Lino recognized that although Drago's offense and defense were outstanding, Setsuna's mana control and physical prowess were extraordinary, leaving him wondering who would win. Realizing Drago's defense was solid, he needed to create an opening. He jumped back a bit to create distance between them, and Drago did the same. Drago then created another mana blade and swung it towards his head, but fortunately, he tilted his head back just in time to avoid it. Drago swung his blade backward to gain force and then attack him with it. He managed to block it with his blade, but was still slightly pushed back by the force. He noticed Drago was using all his mana for that attack, so he immediately leaped backward, avoiding being shattered along with the ground. He noticed he was about to fall off the stage, and Drago, thinking he had finally cornered him, believed he couldn't use his renowned footwork from there. Drago then flexed his muscles and roared confidently, showcasing his steel-like muscles, leaving Layla and the students wondering at the spectacle. Drago dashed towards him with his muscles tensed and launched a punch. But he calmly waited for Drago, and when Drago's punch hit, it merely pierced through him as if he were water. Drago couldn't believe it was just an afterimage. He then appeared above Drago, explaining that if he kept using his mana at the place where he was standing, he would leave an afterimage briefly, surprising Drago. He appeared behind Drago, ready to swing his blade at him, but Drago turned around with his fist ready to counterattack. He told Drago it was the end, and slashed Drago with a swift slash before Drago could hit him. Layla and the other students were shocked to witness the attack, and Lionel noticed it was aimed for a counterattack, capitalizing on the fierce assault. Lionel then shouted that the match was over and declared Setsuna Cromwell the winner,